On June 25, 2025, a Lockheed P-38 Lightning rolled onto the runway at Breckenridge, Texas. Its polished aluminum skin carried the name Jandina III. The engines came up, the airplane accelerated, and then the twin-boom fighter lifted clear of the ground. For most restored warbirds, a first flight is the end of a long mechanical project. For this P-38, it closed a gap that had begun more than 81 years earlier, on a rough wartime airfield in New Guinea. On May 7, 1944, the same aircraft identity, United States Army Air Force's serial number 42-103988, had come down on its belly because its nose wheel would not lower. The pilot survived. The airplane was written off, stripped of useful parts, and left behind in the Pacific. More than half a century later, what remained was recovered from Papua New Guinea. Even then, the story was nowhere near finished. The wreck came out in 1999. It would take roughly another 26 years before Jandina III became an airplane again. The P-38 had entered service only months before its accident. Lockheed built it as a P-38J-15-LO, construction number 2822. The Army Air Forces accepted it at the end of December 1943, and the new fighter quickly began the long movement from the United States toward the Southwest Pacific. By early 1944, it was serving with the 80th Fighter Squadron of the 8th Fighter Group, the unit known as the Headhunters. Its assigned pilot was Captain J.T. Robbins. Its crew chief was Staff Sergeant H.P. Mosbach. Robbins would become one of the most successful American fighter pilots in the Pacific. By the end of his combat career, he would be credited with 22 confirmed aerial victories after 181 combat missions and more than 600 combat hours. But the story of Jandina III is not really about his final score. It is about one particular machine that carried his name into combat and then survived in a form no one could have planned. The name itself was personal. Jandina combined J with Ina, the name used by Robbins' wife, and Robbins applied versions of it to more than one of his P-38s. This aircraft was Jandina III. Wartime photographs make the connection unusually clear. The nose carried the Jandina III name and a distinctive Buddha artwork. Robbins' name appeared on the aircraft, as did Mosbach's. Japanese victory flags were painted beneath the cockpit. Today, those photographs provide an unusually clear link between the wartime fighter and the identity later restored as Jandina III. The P-38 used a tricycle landing gear arrangement. Two main wheels supported the aircraft near the center, while a third wheel beneath the nose held the front of the airplane clear of the ground. On May 7, 1944, that simple arrangement became the difference between an ordinary landing and the end of Jandina III's combat life. Robbins was returning from a mission when a hydraulic problem prevented the nose wheel from being lowered. With the nose gear unavailable, he was directed to make a wheels-up forced landing at Yamai Airfield, west of Sidor. Jandina III settled onto the field on its underside. The propellers struck the ground and bent as the fighter came to rest. Robbins was uninjured. For the pilot, the emergency landing had worked. For the airplane, it was the end. Photographs taken after the accident show why that distinction matters. Jandina III still looked recognizably like a P-38. The twin booms were there. The center nacelle was there. The wings and tail still formed the unmistakable lightning silhouette. But the bent propeller blades and the aircraft's position on the ground told the practical story. This was not a fighter waiting for fuel and another mission. It was written off. In a wartime theater, a written-off aircraft was not necessarily useless. Jandina III still contained equipment, fittings, and components that could support other airplanes. So the process of saving what was valuable began by taking the fighter apart. Useful parts were removed. What had been a complete combat aircraft became a source of spares. As the war moved on, the remains of 42-103988 lost the very completeness that had made the post-crash photographs so striking. From this point, the historical trail becomes less certain. Later accounts do not agree perfectly about where every surviving section of Jandina III spent the following decades. Some place the remaining hulk in the Yamai or Biliao area. Other accounts say surviving material was moved toward Finchhofen, stripped further, and left there. The evidence is not strong enough to choose the more dramatic version and present it as certainty. What can be said safely is simpler. The fighter was stripped, the remaining structure was abandoned, and its precise post-war path is less clearly documented than the accident itself. By 1999, the remains of Jandina III had returned to view. Bruno Carnevale and Ian Whitney, associated with an organization using the name 75 Squadron, obtained or recovered surviving material connected with the P-38. Photographs taken at La provide one of the clearest anchors in the entire post-war story. The contrast with 1944 is severe. The P-38 photographed after Robin's forced landing had still been an almost complete airplane in outline. The material photographed at La was stripped wreckage. Major assemblies and systems were gone. Portions of the nose artwork and victory markings that once made Jandina III immediately recognizable had disappeared. What remained was not a hidden fighter waiting to be rolled onto a runway. It was the beginning of a restoration problem. Recovery can look like the climax because it is physical and visible. Wreckage that has remained in place for decades is finally moved and taken away. But for Jandina III, getting surviving material out of Papua New Guinea solved only the easiest version of the problem. The recovered remains had to become a complete P-38 again. In late 1999, surviving material associated with Jandina III was prepared for export from Lae. It was containerized with other recovered wartime aircraft remains and moved to Australia. But the route out of Papua New Guinea carried a complication. The organization involved in removing Jandina III later came under scrutiny in Papua New Guinea during a parliamentary examination of wartime aircraft wreck recovery and export. The committee scrutinized the group's handling and export of wartime wrecks and raised serious questions about activities associated with Bruno Carnevale, Ian Whitney, and the organization using the 75 Squadron name. But the surviving record does not establish a specific ruling that Jandina III itself had been illegally exported. Whatever the wider dispute, by the end of 1999, its surviving remains were already in Australia. For Jandina III, the physical story was moving on. By February 2002, the surviving airframe had reached the point where it could be sent onward to the United States. Its movement across the Pacific was complete. Now the much longer task began. An airworthy restoration started in California with Westpac Restorations and Claire's Aviation. Work later continued in Colorado. The aircraft eventually became part of the Flying Heritage Collection, but ownership and location changes do not explain what made the project difficult. The photographs do. Look again at the wreckage in 1999, and then at a complete P-38. Between those two images are thousands of individual problems. A Lightning needs a complete load-carrying structure. It needs engines, controls, landing gear, hydraulic and electrical systems, instruments, fuel systems, and many smaller assemblies that must all work together. A static display can sometimes tolerate missing functions hidden beneath finished skin. An airplane intended to fly cannot. That is why the word restoration can be misleading if it suggests a simple process of cleaning, repairing, and repainting an intact machine. Jandina III had been written off, stripped, abandoned, and left incomplete for decades. Returning that identity to the air required rebuilding what no longer existed as a functioning whole. There is also an important limit to what can be claimed about the finished aircraft. Restoration records show that replacement parts had to be manufactured where necessary. What the available evidence does not establish is how much original 1944 material remained in the completed aircraft. It would therefore be misleading to describe the P-38 that flies today as an untouched time capsule, or to imply that restorers merely repaired the wreck and restarted its engines. The historical identity is documented. The provenance connects the restored machine with 42-103988. But the exact balance between surviving wartime material and replacement structure is not sufficiently documented to reduce it to a neat percentage. That uncertainty does not weaken the achievement, it explains it. If Jandina III had survived complete and dry in a hangar, there would have been no 26-year restoration story. Instead, years passed. In 2013, the P-38 was still under restoration. Replacement parts were being manufactured where necessary, and the project remained far from the moment promised by its eventual appearance. Work continued through different locations and organizations. Later, the restoration moved into its final phase in Texas, with Aviation taking on the work needed to bring the Lightning to completion. That is especially true for a complex twin-engine fighter. The goal is not simply to reproduce the shape of a Lightning. The goal is to produce an aircraft whose structure, controls, engines, and systems function together well enough for flight. So the years between recovery and takeoff should not be understood as a long delay after the important work had already been done. They were the important work. By the early 2020s, the project had moved into its final stages at Breckenridge, Texas. The wreck that had crossed the Pacific in pieces was becoming visually recognizable again as Jandina III. The twin booms returned. The center nacelle regained its finished form. The landing gear once again held a complete P-38 above the ground. The markings connected the polished aircraft with the wartime photographs of Robbins's fighter. One question still remained. Would Jandina III actually fly? Late in 2024 and early in 2025, the paperwork began to show that the project was crossing that line. The aircraft was registered in the United States as N988J, carrying serial number 42-103988. Its airworthiness record followed in March 2025 under the experimental exhibition category. The word experimental can sound strange beside an aircraft type that first flew before the Second World War. Here it did not mean that the P-38 was a new prototype. It was part of the operating framework under which a restored historic aircraft of this kind could be flown. More importantly for the story, the paperwork marked a change in status. For years, Jandina III had been a restoration project. Now it was being prepared and accepted as an aircraft that could be operated. The remaining proof could not be issued on paper. It had to happen on a runway. On June 25, 2025, Jandina III was at Stevens County Airport in Breckenridge. Kevin Eldridge was at the controls for the first post-restoration flight. There was no need for a dramatic countdown. The date already carried enough weight. The last time 42-103988 had ended a flight in 1944, Robbins had been unable to lower the nose wheel. He had brought the P-38 down on its belly and walked away while the aircraft was written off. Now, more than 8 decades later, Jandina III was standing on all 3 wheels again. The engines were running. The aircraft taxied. Then it accelerated down the runway. For a restoration that had occupied workshops for more than 2 decades, the decisive moment lasted only seconds. Airspeed increased, the load came off the wheels, and the P-38 lifted into the air. Jandina III was flying. An aircraft identity written off in New Guinea on May 7, 1944, had been traced through stripped remains, recovered in 1999, transported across countries and workshops, rebuilt as an airworthy Lightning, and demonstrated in flight on June 25, 2025. More than 81 years separated the forced landing from the return to the air, and roughly 26 of those years came after the wreck had already been recovered. The wreck had been recovered in 1999. It took another 26 years to recover the airplane. That distinction explains the whole project. Salvage could move metal from one place to another. Restoration had to recreate function. Jandina III's public story continued almost immediately. In 2025, the P-38 appeared at EAA AirVenture Oshkosh, where it became part of Warbirds in Review. Among those connected with the presentation was Robert "Robbie" Robbins, J. Robbins' son. That connection gave the restored aircraft a human continuity, without requiring anyone to invent what the moment meant privately to the family. The name on the nose had been created from Jay and Ina more than 80 years earlier. Now the aircraft bearing that name was again being seen in public with Robbins's family represented beside its story. The restoration also received major recognition at Oshkosh, including the World War II Warbird Grand Champion Award, while Aviation received restoration honors for the work that brought the project to completion. Later that year, Jandina III reached Flying Heritage and Combat Armor Museum at Payne Field in Everett, Washington. Its final setting creates one last contrast with the photographs from New Guinea. The image from May 1944 shows a P-38 on its belly. The aircraft still looks remarkably complete, but its operational life is over. Bent propellers mark the forced landing. The machine will be stripped rather than repaired. The images from 1999 show what decades and wartime salvage had left behind. The recognizable fighter has become incomplete wreckage. Even some of the markings that once made Jandina III visually distinctive have disappeared. The aircraft seen today looks complete again. It stands on its landing gear. Its twin booms, center nacelle, and polished surfaces once more form the silhouette of a Lightning. More importantly, it has already done what a static reconstruction never has to do. It has flown. That does not make it an untouched survivor of May 1944. In a way, describing it as one would erase the most extraordinary part of the story. Jandina III survived precisely because it was not preserved intact. It survived a forced landing that ended its military career. It survived being stripped because enough identifiable structure and history remained afterward. It survived the uncertainty of the post-war decades because those remains were eventually recognized and removed. And its identity survived the restoration because the people rebuilding it continued to connect the finished aircraft with the documented history of 42-103988. There is an irony in the two most important landings in the story. In 1944, Robbins's successful emergency landing saved the pilot but ended the aircraft's operational career. In 2025, the restoration's success could only be demonstrated by reversing that final image. The P-38 had to roll on its landing gear, accelerate, and leave the ground again. That is why the story cannot end with the moment the wreck was recovered from Papua New Guinea. Recovery moved the remains. It did not restore what had been lost. Nor can it end with polished metal in a workshop. A complete silhouette was not the objective. The real ending came when the wheels lifted from the runway in Texas. For more than half a century after the war, Jandina III existed as incomplete remnants of an aircraft that the Army Air Forces had already written off and stripped for useful parts. Then, for another quarter century, it existed as a restoration whose final outcome was still somewhere in the future. Only in June 2025 did those two histories finally meet. The fighter that Robbins had been forced to leave behind was never preserved as a sealed wartime time capsule. Too much had happened to it for that. Parts had been removed. The remains had deteriorated. Their exact post-war route is not perfectly documented. The recovery itself became entangled in a wider controversy over wartime wrecks leaving Papua New Guinea. And the finished aircraft required a rebuilding effort so extensive that the precise proportion of surviving original material cannot be stated responsibly from the available record. But the identity was not lost. The serial number could still be traced. The wartime photographs survived. The name was documented. The history could still be followed. And after 81 years, an aircraft carrying that identity returned to the sky. Jandina III survived the war in an unusual way, not by remaining untouched, and not by escaping damage, but by leaving enough behind for another generation to begin again. The wreck came out of New Guinea in 1999. 26 years later, the Lightning finally came back with it.